COVID is still dominating the news. It's everywhere we look. It's commanding every broadcast. It's flooding every internet site. Hospitalizations are near record. There's a new strain of corona apparently in the UK that is making its way to the United States and probably around the world. And of course, we all know that various companies in the US are rolling out a vaccine. But what I want to talk about more often is the spiritual part of this. It's reasonable to ask what God's place is in all of this. Atheists are quite critical of God at this point, as they are at every point in God, in their thoughts about God. They're critical that God is not answering the prayers of the world and making it go away. And if God really existed, then this would be a time when we would see that he was answering the prayers of the people of the world. But it's my role as the third choice to find that point of contact between biblical teaching and current events. So, as far as scientifically speaking, we know how this is happening, or at least we're being told where the evidence points as to how the coronavirus started and how it's spreading and where it's coming from. But a more pertinent question that comes up is why? Why is this happening? People see suffering and they want to know whether God is doing it and why God isn't stopping it and what God's role is. So in John chapter 9, we read a story about Jesus healing a man who's been blind from birth. And the disciples asked, who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it he or was it his parents? And Jesus answered, that's not how things work. Neither of those is the case. This particular thing, he says, happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. So it's interesting to hear Jesus tell us that that's not how things work. Not all physical ailments come from spiritual sources. Sometimes physical things have physical causes. Sometimes the suffering in the world happens because science is being science, viruses happen, the world is being the world, and it's cause and effect the way God created cause and effect to work. But as we read into John chapter 9, though, we will find out that it's really a living parable, despite that it really happened. This man really was born blind, and Jesus really did heal him. But it's a living parable that we can learn spiritual things from. And what Jesus is trying to teach us, among other things, in this story, is that it's sin that causes spiritual blindness. And that's more the point of John chapter 9. So as I said, I fully believe that this miracle really happened. It's not a metaphor. But Jesus' comment on it makes more sense if we take the story as a living historical parable rather than addressing the problem of evil and suffering. Jesus is not trying to tell us about evil and suffering. He's not giving us a theology of suffering. Instead, he's explaining more about how the gospel works than about how the world works. So hopefully we can understand that. What the point of this, besides helping a man who had been blind from birth and actually literally healing him, he's telling us that people are born dead in their sins and are spiritually blind from birth. And that the only way that kind of spiritual blindness can be healed is when the work of God is displayed in their life. So what does any of this have to do with COVID? I think what it has to do with COVID is that we make mistakes of judging others when we claim that COVID-19 is God's judgment on a particular sin or a particular country or a particular cause or a sin of our own choosing where we say, well, God made COVID happen because he's judging the sin of, and then fill in the blank. I think that's a mistake. Not every disease has a spiritual source in that sense, and we learn that from John 9. I also think we make mistakes when we rush to the conclusion that COVID is a sign of the end times. Though we are always supposed to be ready for the return of Jesus, This may or may not be it. There have been a lot of pandemics through history, and we've learned that just because there's a pandemic happen doesn't mean it's the end times. So John chapter 9 teaches us many, many things. But one of those is, rather than pin blame, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from COVID? In the case of John 9, what they were learning from the man's blindness was about the identity and the deity of Jesus. And so what does COVID teach us? Well, instead of thinking, whom can I blame for COVID, we should think of COVID in terms of, what can we learn from this? Every day when we watch what's happening, what can we learn about God? What can we learn about ourselves? And what can we learn about how we're supposed to act in the world? And I think that's the message of God for us in COVID. Among other things, we are learning that countries can actually work together. We are learning about the compassion and the generosity of many people. We are learning about the marvels of science and all the things that we have learned about our world. We are learning about the stupidities and the injuriousness of politics and how they are sometimes more of a problem than they are a solution. But at the same time, we are learning that the government can be helpful and that there are benefits to what the government is trying to do. We are learning in all this how much the world needs Jesus. We are learning where the church is strong and where the church is weak. We are learning how poorly most people know the Bible, Christians included. We are also learning how sacrificial people can be. There's so many things we can learn every day from COVID. About God, we are learning that God uses people as his agents of love and help in the world. We are learning that God's answers to prayer are not always just directly doing exactly what we ask when we ask it. We are learning that the character of God is not to be evaluated on the criteria of our circumstances. So as we continue through this COVID pandemic and its new forms, because it doesn't seem to be going away, we should be using each day to ask and answer the question, what is God teaching us through this? That is our most productive approach to understanding God's purposes and role in COVID-19. We have to make every minute count.